Thanks, fam. Thanks so much for coming out on a Thursday evening for what I've been lovingly saying to everybody in our email chat is really like a bit of an artsy dinner party and you get to be voyeurs. So that's how it's going to run, if that's okay with you. We have Honor, who's on screen with us. Also have Daniel and Sally here tonight. I'm Stephanie, I'm your host, but I'm also participating as an artist in this conversation as well. We're here on Bunurong and Wurundjeri land. We're at this crossroads in the city of Melbourne, where two groups of people, as part of the greater Eastern Kulin Nation Alliance, have been meeting and gathering and talking and sharing knowledge and history, have been dancing, have been singing for thousands of years. And as artists and makers and authors, it's a wonderful privilege to be here now and in our own ways find moments to contribute to that legacy. So this is a pretty free-flowing conversation, people, and I'm just putting this out there to my cohorts here. We're going to chat amongst ourselves, we're going to talk to each other, ask questions of each other. At no time rely on me to ask you questions. You like that hosting style? We're talking about mental health and creativity as part of this brainstorm. It's something that on the way here, you're all held up because of me. I will own up to that, so thank you for your patience. I've just come from seeing my mum in hospital. She had major neurosurgery today, had a piece of her spine in her neck removed and a prosthesis put in. Thank you, science. It's an amazing thing. And it was keyhole surgery, and I thought, oh, I'm going to see her and she's going to be out of it. She was making jokes, and I was like, my goodness, this is amazing. And all throughout it, I was really, really strong and steadfast for my family because I'm the one who deals with the crises and everyone freaks out. And I was cool until I saw my little frail mum in that bed. And she was just suddenly, I mean, given that, like, I'm a giraffe of a human, okay? My mum comes up to here on me, but she's always felt like a tower house, an absolute force to deal with. But she really kind of shrunk in that little bed in front of me today, and I was going, oh, on all days, this is the day we're having this conversation. Because when I think about it, my first experiences of mental health and our family situation is what led me to be creative through the hands of my mum. I might get to that story, I'm just going to leave that out there and verbally, throw it at you because that's where I've come from with my brain. And I think at this age and stage, I really believe that we all just got to let some masks down and be a bit more honest about these things. I'm really curious to hear from all three of my colleagues here about your first intersections with mental health and that rolling into creativity, maybe starting creativity. What does that look like for each of you? Anna, I'm going to throw to you first.
I was thinking about this ahead of tonight's talk. So I'll just do like a little potted history of myself in terms of mental health. I won't do everything, don't worry. But just potted history of my mental health experiences and then how they kind of relate to the creative stuff that I've done. But for me, when I was a teenager, I had some experiences of being kind of what would be put in the bucket of like anxious and depressed. And that was sort of a part of my early life. And then when I was 21, I went overseas and I had a total mental breakdown. And I was really a very challenging place, away from home and very suicidal. And that was just a very profound experience to have at that age. And then pretty much all throughout my 20s, that kind of kept happening every so often. It might be every year, it might be every couple of years. And so I think I ended up spending maybe, because I'm in my 30s now, ended up spending maybe 3 or 4 years in that kind of actively suicidal space, which is a long time. I don't recommend it. And that was just a very, very profound and complex, and I would say confusing experience. Because one of the things I've done that I'm most known for is I did a podcast with the ABC a few years back called No Feeling is Final. And that was really documenting some of these experiences. And I'm making that into a special live show for the Big Anxiety. So you should come. That's Saturday week. And I'm quite nervous about it. But it's going to be great. But part of the reason why I wanted to do that. So for me, I've always kind of, creativity has been this sort of self-expression output of like, what do you do with confusing life experiences? Like, what if we made something? And not necessarily in a kind of art career type of way, but in a more personal, feels like it needs to be done sort of a way. But when I actually pitched to do this podcast with the ABC, I actually did not want to do a show about myself. It was when ABC had this $1 million podcasting fund application program out, and I put in a pitch, and initially the pitch that I showed to a brilliant ABC producer, Ian Walker, was kind of more of a straight up documentary series talking about some of these really niche ideas that are in mental health policy. Because what I found for me was that I'd gone through the system and basically just did not meet my expectations of what I thought was going to happen. Like I was like, thought that one thing was going to happen, and that is not at all what happened at all. And particularly like after, I felt like at that time in particular, I feel like it's getting more nuanced, but at that time there was a lot of conversation that was like, just ask for help, and not much after that piece of the equation. So I was like, I'm asking for help any which way. Like, if anyone's got help, I'll try it. I'll do this therapy, that therapy, this drug, whatever. Like, give it to me. So basically just didn't kind of match my reality. And but this producer at ABC was like, for this show to actually be something that people really engage with, it needs to have a story that it hangs off. And I was like, well, I do happen to have all these recordings from inside Psych Hospital and like of myself and all this stuff that I've randomly kept over years because I am a slightly weird person. And he was like, that would be great. If you want to do that, that would make an awesome show. And so went through and kind of did that process, the show got greenlit. And but I just kind of want to mention this because at the time when I pitched that show, I was in a dark place. This is where there's this like intersection of like art and mental health. Like I was not sure about doing that show at all. And so when I got the call being like, hey, do you want to do this? I was like, oh, I don't know. And ABC were awesome. I think they gave me about 3 months, or I found myself 3 months, let me share the truth, before I actually signed the contract. And I met this amazing crew of people at ABC who worked on the show. Joel Werner, who's an amazing just amazing podcast producer, Alice Moldovan, and I also brought in my partner who we work in a similar space, in the mental health space, who co-wrote the show with me. And I was actually thinking about it when I was looking up Daniel's work with, oh my gosh, Arts and Health Hub, in terms of like, how do you support artists like through their work? Like that was a very amazing experience in terms of being given the space to sign on in a way where I knew that they wanted to tell this story in this way that I wanted to tell it. Because the show, anyway, I'll stop talking. The show, I'll stop talking. I could talk forever.
It sounds like an amazing start, and amazingly terrifying and exciting, and lots of emotions and feelings all at once to come together. And I think I got a wave of all of those things in anticipation of going to your show next Saturday night. So on the 15th is Honour's show. Please look it up. It's part of the big anxiety program. But you touched on, feeling really connected when you were seeing some of Daniel's work. Daniel, listening to Honour there, is that mirroring part of your process in how mental health and arts practice have been intersectional for you?
I have to come back to the mum.
Okay.
Because I was a very troubled young person.
Yeah.
And also a very silent young person. So if you spoke to me, I looked at the floor and just bowed my head. And it was my mum that... We lived in a sort of back to front house, so my bedroom was downstairs and my mum's room was upstairs. And at night, my mum would write a letter and she would leave it at the bottom of the stairs for me to read, instead of asking me what's going on, how are you feeling? And I would also write a letter and I would leave it for her and she would read it in bed and respond, and I would read it on the bus. And so that was my first way of being creative, was writing. In the absence of words, because I didn't have words to describe all of my mental health problems at 9, 10, 11. And then later on it was visual art that took over, because I also felt that using words was far too vulnerable for me. So actually making images, I can give you codes in images that give you a sense of feelings, but I feel like I still can control how much I share. But I was not a creative person as a kid. I, at school, was told, you are shit. Like, you cannot draw this bowl of fruit. And who wants to draw bowls of fruit? I've got other things to do.
I never got that.
I
was
make
always
you
just like,
draw balls of fruit.
feed me the food. Don't show an African woman food and say paint. No, feed me the food.
So my creative side came out of the intersection of my mental health difficulties, which was completely unexpected. And it beautifully derailed my life in that I didn't go to university to do what I was going to do. I went and did photography, and then I went back to university and did more photography. And it's just, photography is so intrinsically linked to how I navigate the world, process things, feelings, incidents. I can't live without making images.
I had a weirdly similar experience with my mum. When I was younger, but my hall pass is music. So to everybody who meets me now, they generally meet quite a chatterbox and an energetic person. My family makes up that my family says that I'm making up for lost time, because when I was a kid, I was really, really quiet. But my mum noticed that I would hug speakers. And Mum would be like, why? Come away from the speakers, that's bad for your ears. I'd be like, no, I want to be where the rainbows are coming out. And Mum was like, okay, sure, child, whatever. Mum played piano, Dad was a cellist, so it was kind of music around the house, and they love classical music, but they always had a piano. And from about the age of like 1.5, like really sitting up, she noticed that she could put me next to her, she'd play something and my hand would copy her and I would play by ear with her. I wouldn't talk, but I just play all these sounds. And sometimes she'd ask me questions and I'd go to the piano and I'd play my answer. So yeah, the mum thing, mums are amazing. But I do wonder, we were talking before, just setting up lights and things like that. Sally, you were talking about your family's experience now, discovering different mental states or brain states, I would say, with neurodiversity. And you said, oh, but I don't have it. So what's your journey been like? The three of us have talked about various intersections for us, but what's your journey been like in linking those two things from an author's perspective? So you're about the words.
I am about the words. I have a mum story too, actually. And my mum also was the link to the creativity. She wrote a book while she was pregnant with me. It was a non-fiction book, but I always attribute that. I feel like I must have got some creativity there. And she was the one who really instilled the love of reading in me. She was a school teacher. She is a school teacher. She is alive. She was a school teacher. And she would always bring me books to read. And if I was reading something that I loved, she made sure that I got the next book in the series before I was finished, reading that one. And that's always been my best advice to people who want their kids to read. I say, put the book in their hands. Don't let them not have that opportunity. But yesterday, as it happens, my dear old mum has Parkinson's disease, and she has really struggled with the losing of her ability to get around and do things. And she was flying to Queensland to visit my brother, and my dad was meant to be going, and at the last minute he couldn't go. And we weren't sure, she couldn't go on her own, and she really wanted to go. And we ended up what we called a family relay, where mum was the baton. So I drove her to the airport. My aunt was waiting to collect her from the car, deliver her onto the plane. They rode on a golf buggy, and she put her onto the plane, and my brothers were waiting at the other end to get her off the plane. And my mum is very proud, and I just kept thinking she will hate this. And afterwards, last night, she texted me and she said, I've never felt so loved the way that, she didn't like it, but she was able to look at it and feel the love of the way that we wanted to get her there. So I guess to bring it back to my journey to become a writer and mental health, it was almost upside down for me, because when I started writing, I considered myself a very happy, mentally stable woman. I was pregnant with my first child, and I'd always wanted to write a book. And I wrote a book, worst book in the world.
Is that the one that's in the foyer after, or...?
No, I hope not.
It's a new one.
Luckily, that book was published eventually, but only in the German language. And if anyone can speak German, don't buy it.
Wunderbar. I'm into this. Yeah.
But so I wrote that book, and I guess someone referred to it recently as, my mental health was very good, but I had the what my friend referred to as the run-of-the-mill mental health issues like depression and anxiety, that really, let's face it, we all have. But then I became a mother to a son first and then a daughter, and I noticed straight away that my children had differences in the way that they were learning and behaving, and I mean the most magnificent children you can possibly imagine. I knew my son was autistic fairly early on. What was once called Asperger's. He's quite a textbook case, with the gifted in maths, and very literal. And then I had a daughter who did not appear anything like my son, and she was having difficulties with learning and reading and various things, as well as some behavioural issues. And since then, they have both been diagnosed with autism, which I think is so interesting, because people can get so kind of dependent on one image of a way that something like autism can be presented, and they could not be more different, and they are both quite clearly autistic. But my daughter also has ADHD, and at the time that she was diagnosed, I'd written 5 books, I think, and I remember being told by her teacher that she wasn't concentrating, that she looked like she was paying attention, but she just wasn't taking things in. And I remember saying to her, what's going on? What's happening at school? And she said, well, what I do is I look at the teacher, and if what they're saying is really boring, I just make up a story in my head.
I think I still do that.
Absolutely.
She described this story to me about how the school was burning down and she was the hero, and she went and rescued someone from the burning building, and she came outside and everyone clapped and she was the hero. And she finished telling me this story, and I said, well, yeah, like, isn't that what everyone does? And she was later diagnosed with ADHD. I told the paediatrician that story. And then I said, I think I might have it too. And he said, yeah. And what was interesting is that I then got a referral for a diagnosis. And when my psychiatrist diagnosed me, he said, you are the most textbook case I've ever seen in terms of, I'm messy and I lose all my stuff and I don't show up for things that I'm supposed to, be at. But mostly, he said, 90% of his patients with ADHD were a creative person. They were an artist, they were a writer, they were a musician, they were an actor. And so even though I'd never kind of thought that I started writing because of mental health or because of neurodiversity, maybe I did. And,
I think sometimes we're drawn to certain pathways that work with our brains, and also work with emotional fluctuation, which is a key part of many types of mental illness and mental health. We're halfway through this conversation. We've done a setup. We've got to know each other. We've worked out where we started in our origin stories, which are all delightful. And to be honest, I could just ask you about them all night because I think they're quite fascinating. But it is also my job to ask you some questions to unpack and unpick.
Can I just check? Have
Yeah.
you finished the starters? Because we're at the dinner party.
Yeah.
We're moving on to main.
This is main course.
Entree is done.
Honna's just walked in with this huge main course and we're about to tuck in. So, there's something you said there earlier, Sally, and you said, well, let's face it, with depression and anxiety, don't we all have it? I want to do a pop quiz. Feel free to answer, not answer, it's up to you. But given that we're in a semi-dark room, there's a little bit of anonymity here. I hope you can feel like you want to participate. Raise your hand if depression and or anxiety has been part of your existence to date. Hello. This is, and I'm both hands up as well. That's quite a significant group. All right, so Anna, we're going to tell you that was like a good 70% of the people here. Yeah. Alrighty, so this has been a big part. The second part of it is, given our current context and pandemic, raise your hand if depression and or anxiety was part of your existence prior to pandemic. Still equally about as many hands, Anna.
Oh, wow.
Okay, all right. One of the things that I personally have struggled with my many intersections, there's just, I always struggle with bios. I don't know how you do with bios, but my bio, there's just lots of things to say. And I feel like sometimes I'm almost like an over-representer in so many things. But as soon as people find out that I'm Rwandan, everyone asks about the genocide. Everyone. Without fail. No, serious. It's coffee, gorillas and genocide. Those are the three things that everyone knows about Rwanda. Now, a fourth. Hi, I'm Stephanie. There's other things that go on with Rwanda. But, people want to know your intersection with that because it's in our living memory. It's 94, right? And I do have a connection to that. And I did go there shortly after the so-called end, in inverted commas, with my mum, and I was about 12. And I went in a teenager and I sure as shit didn't come out one. But when it comes to my music, my writing as a composer, and particularly in classical music as well, so many times lecturers, teachers would say, you've got to draw upon that stuff. That's what artists do. They draw upon the hard, dark stuff. I want you to talk about that in your writing. And I was like, hang on. I get to talk about what I want at any one time as an artist. You do not get to demand from me that my story becomes your trauma porn, because that's very often what it can feel like. And that's just like one of other intersections. And I wonder for the three of you, so Honor, I'm coming back to you. Thank you for serving us this main course. You know, how do you go with representation, the burden of representation maybe, with your work? Because you've released a work that's out there, you can listen to Honor's podcast, that is very intimate and is very revealing. You know, and what happens from that point?
Oh my gosh, that's such a big question. And I think like one thing I want to say up front about that is like, I think sometimes people look at some of the things that I've done and want to do the same things, but we don't talk often enough about all the fallout from that. Like, it's not a like no cost exercise to talk about these things in public. There's lots of wonderful things that come out of it, but that's not the reason why I do it. I think the reason why I do it is just because well, there's a couple of reasons. It started out because I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know what's going on with what's happening to me. But nowadays it's actually much more about, I work in mental health policy. So I actually got to work on the recent Royal Commission into the Victorian mental health system and lead some of the recommendations in terms of implementing that. And there's just all these really complex, nuanced, kind of philosophical debates that are happening in this like niche mental health policy land. And I'm interested in actually breaking those open so that then we can have a much more sort of nuanced debate. I feel like we're getting past the sort of this sounds cynical, but I don't mean it in a cynical way. I just mean like the kind of public narrative was like, let's talk about it. It's okay to talk about, ask for help. Now we've gotten to a point, asking for help is the number one reason people see their GP in Australia at the moment. So we are doing that. So that's great. That's a like really big achievement. But now we're moving on like forward from that in terms of, well, actually, what is help? What is good help? What would that look like? What are the kinds of responses that we have to these experiences? Are some of them like, what are some of them helpful? Are some of them unhelpful? And I feel like that's kind of, in terms of that, is pushing the envelope. So to go back to your question though, like, I think one of the things that I really struggle with, or that I know has been really challenging about making this live show is that like, it's so much more intimate than a podcast, because like a podcast you can kind of pretend it doesn't exist and you know people are listening to it somewhere, but like you're like, oh, if I'm not thinking about it, it doesn't exist, and I didn't do that, so I don't feel so vulnerable. But I think the thing that I find hard, because I work in the mental health space as well, is making something that is and trying to remember and hold on to, like, this is art, not policy. So it actually is supposed to be this expression that is not completely couched, because to make it completely couched would actually ruin the experience of it being a way of understanding what someone else's experience is. Does that make sense? Like, because
It totally does. But I also am going to say, as an observation, Honor, it feels like in your world, given that's your day job and your artistic practice, you've got like capital M, capital H, mental health in a lot of what you do. And I guess my short follow-up question for you is, do you ever feel like that is your responsibility to represent, or do you get to be Honor the artist without mental health in any way being a part of the discussion?
That's a good question. I definitely feel a responsibility, but it's not actually just in terms of my art. I feel the same responsibility in terms of the work that I do in mental health policy land. Like, I feel like I accidentally sort of ended up in this position where I am like in these rooms that have influence or whatever, and like really need to, I suppose, rise up to that challenge. But so I do have this question, because I have all these other ideas in my mind of like different projects that are not to do with this subject, that I'm like, well, maybe one day I'll make that documentary about that thing, or because I do want, like, I love creative work. I love that process if it's in the right environment. So I would say that very specifically. Like, if it is resourced enough and supported enough that it's a good process, because otherwise I'll just like burn in a like flaming fire. But
Do not
but
burn the dinner, Honor. We've still
I'm
got more
trying
to
not burn the
come.
dinner. But the thing that I would say, like, just because I kind of want to mention this, because I think I'm kind of curious about how we talk about mental health stories in public, is that it can be really easy to actually unintentionally exploit your own experience. And you've got to be very in tune with yourself about how you do that. And that's not like I'm not thinking of anyone in particular. I'm actually just thinking of myself in that process of, like, it's not actually like one boundary that you make and you're like, this is my line, but it's more like there's a million different decisions you make about what you reveal about yourself. And so I know that people think I reveal a lot, and I definitely do by some standards, but there is a lot that I do not reveal about myself. And in some ways, there's things that I've chosen to be public about that are not, people aren't usually that public about, but there's a lot of things that I'm actually quite private about at the same time. And I think that particularly, like, I would say this particularly for younger people as well, is that because of my work in mental health, I know that a lot of places want people's personal lived experience story, but you need to, like, it is your story and your life, and not everyone is stigma free. And I've been in job interviews where someone's been like, I found a video of you on the internet in the hospital. So can you
Story
tell
of
me a
my
little bit about
life.
that?
That happens all the time.
And yeah, it's just it is quite, I just say it's quite confronting. So you've got to find ways to navigate it. I suppose that's
I'm going to
just all I'd
stop
say.
you there because Daniel's done a lot of vigorous nodding here, and I feel like he's about to pass the peas and he's got some tea to bring to the table.
They are petit pois peas.
Oh, welcome and come on down.
It made me think about what we were saying earlier about like, when do you know when something is done? When do you know when something is ready? And I was thinking about aside from more participatory projects, lots of my work, it comes from a real lived experience of mine. So I'm not thinking about where it's going at the beginning. I'm thinking about how am I using this practice to understand things and process. And it's only later on then I start thinking about, oh, this is a thing that's going to go out into the world. Sometimes I don't release things into the world because they're not for you, they're for me. But I make them for me first. So then I have to go through a process of thinking about my criteria of what I allow to go out into the world. And I was just thinking about, in my early 20s, giving a talk about a project and feeling really pressured. Like, a few people kept hammering me about, like, what have you been diagnosed with? And I felt like, you are pushing me to disclose something I don't want to talk about. And then I went away from that event and I thought, I'm going to make a mental list of the things that I am happy to disclose because they don't make me feel like I am raw, and I have to, when I write a statement about my work, I will write 10 pages and then I'll strip it back to 2 paragraphs because it's my story and I get to tell you the bits that I want to tell you. And if every time I get up, and introduce my work or exhibit it, I leave distressed, then I'm doing a disservice to myself because this is just about sharing my artwork, not every detail of my life with complete strangers. So I now have that, like, interior criteria in my head where I think, I go through a series of images and I think that one is too personal. I've described that thing which is too personal. That's not for you, that's for me. I shared the entirety of the story with friends, but when it's going out into the world, I have to check myself and think, how do I take care of myself when this thing goes into, once it's online, it's online. I'll never be able to take it back.
It was also interesting what you said about the kind of third person in the equation, which is you'd look at a series of, so this was before we came out here conversation, but that you would look at a series of pictures and think, you know, they all could be spectacular, but now I need to think about who's going to be looking at it. And they also, you know, how can I bring this experience to them without them having the backstory about you? And that is another part of the equation.
I think it would be really boring for people to engage with my work that was entirely narcissistic and all I did was tell you about every mental health crisis I've ever had. So I have to remove certain parts to make it accessible to a wider audience. So you see yourself in the work or you see someone else that you know in the work. And that's really tricky. You're never going to make everybody happy. But I also, you know, I can still hold on to what it means to me. I can still hold on to images that don't make it into the public. It's not that they don't exist. They're just too special. They're just mine.
And on the work...
I love that.
On the work, Daniel, part of your work now is creating an organisation that engages with this. Do you want to talk about what led you to move beyond yourself as a maker, but hosting a space where this is at the forefront of what you do day to day?
Yes, I finished my photography masters and immediately felt like I had no kind of peers. Everybody on my course, you know, doing really beautiful photography work, but of trees or something, nothing to do with mental health. And then I thought...
It was the fruit, wasn't it?
It was the fruit haunting me. And so I started like just bringing together artists that were making work around mental health and feeling like, oh, you know, within the art world, people are really shitty to each other in the commercial art world. And I was like, how can I make a really kind, supportive space where we lift each other up, we share resources, we don't compete, and we don't crawl over each other's bodies? And starting an organisation that is...
That's revolutionary in the arts. Does anyone else have that feeling? You're laughing loudly. I feel like that's...
But it's so
That's
easy
unheard
just to
of.
be nice, right? It's so easy to be nice. I don't get it.
Not in the arts world, clearly not. We've had centuries of people being really bad to each other and then saying, but it's all part of the arts.
No, I've put that in the bin. So the organisation that I've started and been running for about 7 years is called the Arts and Health Hub, and it's, you know, bringing together artists who are exploring health in their practice, whatever that means to them, and it's about supporting one another. So there's no competition. If you turn up and there's competition, like, get out. This is not the right space. And then there's, you know, providing training and opportunities for people that have more diverse experiences that don't come from, you know, privilege, that don't come from art schools, who have these incredible lived experiences but don't often get the stage and platform to actually, you know, undertake projects or learn about how to run participatory arts projects. And to me, that's just about, like, what value in bringing in people that have an amazing array of experiences instead of the same old experiences, which is the commercial art world. So.
I love this tea. It's a very spicy tea that's coming with our dinner. Sally, with your writing as an author, like I can only relate to that in the sense of as a composer, I get to write stuff that, you know, given the title, it can be really a bit of a misnomer. It can be quite ambiguous. I can be pouring my heart out in my musical language that I know, but not actually be didactic, not give you any program notes as to what's going on, right? So you've got to have skin in the game to go through the process and gain a narrative out of it. You can literally write characters in your work. Do you feel like parts of you have been revealed through your writing in that way, that you get to kind of hide them in a character rather than say, this is me, Sally, by the way?
That's a great question. I mean, I was thinking when we were all talking that it is a little bit different because I write fiction and also because all of the writing that I do is for a reader. And we were talking before about responsibilities and you know, my ultimate responsibility is to the reader, and as a commercial fiction writer, it is to give the reader a cracking good experience. You know, that's my number one. And of course, as part of that, what gives the reader a cracking good experience? It's creating characters that feel real and authentic and that are facing challenges that you and I face. Mm-hmm. And that's where mental health always features in my books. It's so common. It's something that's so, fascinating to explore. And I guess that is where it comes into little pieces of myself will start to fall out onto the page, not because I feel a responsibility to be representative necessarily. And in fact, as I said, I am in the autism community. There's an expression, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And my children are, the perfect example of that. And so when I create a character, they just have to be one character. And they don't have to be representative of everything. And the things that readers will see in my characters or my plot, and they're often the strangest little things, a little line that I threw in that I didn't really think about, or a description of something that people will come up and say, I had that exact thought, or I do that. And it's not just me, certainly not. In fact, just today, a friend of mine was telling me that she read, it's fallen out of my head, but the book about the woman who stopped opening her mail, and it was about depression, and she said when she read that, someone said to her, well, I just didn't believe it, because who would stop opening their mail for 2 years? And she said, that was me. I stopped opening my mail. I've done it too. When I was depressed, I stopped opening my mail. I'm like, doesn't everyone do that? It's like, who opens their mail? And so I think that in a sense, while I'm not coming at it to be representative, to change the world, to be everything to everyone, these books, these photographs, this art that is out there at this particular time, it provides a reference point for people to be able to see themselves, to see their pain, and also to look back upon. Like if we look back on books that were written in the 1920s or 30s or 50s, we can see not just what that story is about, but we can see instantly how the world felt about women, how the world felt about people of colour. All of these things that we create just give a little touchstone to people as we move forward of where we're at. And so, I suppose it's a backward way that, I hope to contribute. As well as the old, it's good to escape in a book. That's good for the mental health as well.
One of my favourite phrases is, creators are the documenters of our time. In a way, we are as important as historians with the perspectives that we have to share. I wonder, maybe pre-diagnosis, pre-learning about your children's neurodiversity, when it came to writing characters in books who live with different conditions, do you phone a friend? How does that look in terms of research? Because I know if someone was going to write about a Rwandan woman, I would really want them to talk to a Rwandan woman. You know what I mean? Like it's that thing. And I've got a direct reference with that. There was someone who wanted to do a project in the city of Melbourne referencing Rwandan people, and they hadn't talked to any members of the community. And I'm like, there's 1,200 of us in Australia. We all know each other. Like it's a very small community. There's less than 200 in Victoria. No one had been contacted. And I was like, who are you? It upset me because it's not to say that we would say no, actually. We're really keen to collaborate, engage with people. But I kind of think about moments of that and just go, well, when someone's writing with this like intimacy, when you're creating characters, you're creating intimacy. You've got an insight into their world. How much research do you go into to feel like you're not making something up and it is a valid set of experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really comes down to, which is something I think about an enormous amount, what you're talking about, writing from the experience of a Rwandan woman, for example. We have to think about as storytellers whose story we're telling and why. And it's a discussion that is endless, and everyone will have their own opinions on it. And as a creative person, we have to kind of choose a spot. For me, in general, I will write about experiences that have been very close to me, and to that end, I did have an autistic character in my book, The Good Sister, and I thought long and hard about that decision. The short answer to your question is I do a lot of research as well as it being close to me, but just on writing a character that was autistic, I had to think about it because I am neurodiverse, but I have ADHD, I'm not autistic. And I thought, why am I doing this? Because trauma porn, I think, is a real thing, and it is it does so much damage, and that's something that I really would never want to do. And so I think the questions I ask myself when I am making a decision of a character's story to follow is why? Why am I choosing to do this? Will I do harm in writing it? And is there a reason that I'm doing it that hasn't already been done? So autism had been done really well and had been done by some people who were autistic themselves. I've read some fantastic books that have been done. Could I add anything that they couldn't? Probably not. The two things that made me decide to write that character was, firstly, one thing that I don't see enough of in the neurodiverse world of literature yet, but it's getting better, is to have neurodiverse characters in books not because they're neurodiverse, not living a world of discovering they're neurodiverse or someone else coming to terms with them being neurodiverse, but they're just in the book because they're a human being and they're facing obstacles that are completely separate from that.
And because we're everywhere.
Yeah, well, like anxiety and depression, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
And so, you know, a little bit for my children, I wanted them to see themselves. And so I felt, obviously, I've been in the community for many years now, and I felt like I could potentially do an okay job. I also spoke to an enormous amount of people, and both my husband, my son and my daughter all read the book, who are all autistic. The other reason I did it was that what I wanted to highlight, there is a condition called sensory processing disorder, which is very, very common comorbidity of autism and ADHD, actually. And that was something that I didn't see a lot of. You know, we were seeing some great books featuring autistic heroines and heroes, but I thought this is something that I would love the world to understand. It's something that I'm constantly explaining to people if my children are having a meltdown, or they can't wear their school uniform because it's not soft, or they can't, they have to wear sunglasses, or they have to wear earplugs. And I wanted the world to know.
Visor.
Yep. I thought I could possibly do some good. That, again, as I say, I write books, you know, to entertain people. That's my goal. But if I am going to stray into something that isn't my lane, I want to be able to answer those questions. And also, I wasn't telling the story of what it's like to be autistic. I was telling a story of an autistic woman living a different tale. But I give it an enormous amount of thought, and I think it's something that there's no good answers, but we should all be thinking about.
Well, it's great to hear, and it's great to hear that set of criteria as well. I think that's a wonderful thing that any of us could be applying to our different practices. At this point...
Do you mind if I just drop a stat on you?
Have you brought the chocolate mousse? Because we're on the home stretch and it's dessert time.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, just because we mentioned a few times around the prevalence of mental health conditions, I just wanted to say that made me think that there's this longitudinal study that's kind of the first that kind of looks at this out of New Zealand, and it found that 86% of folks will meet the criteria for some mental health condition by the age 45. So it's just kind of borne out in the stats as well. That's all. I don't have dessert. That was just a side plate.
I think that was a coffee and an amuse-bouche for the chocolate that Daniel's about to serve you. Daniel, going forward, we're all part of this this event, this moment, the big anxiety, you know, which is a huge term to name a thing and to be artists interacting with that term and that kind of thing. What do you see as some of the problems that you want to, you know, address head on and tackle, say, in the next 10 years with that intersection of mental health and artistry and creativity? I just put salt in the coffee, didn't I?
I mean, I don't think there's a lack of, we're using food metaphors, hunger and thirst for people to engage in arts projects to understand their mental health, but what there is a lack of is resources, lack of collaboration between sectors, which is, please change. And also even within the communities of people that live with various mental health difficulties, I find that some people are all arguing about the same thing. So the fact that, we use different words to describe different things, can we just accept that we use different words to describe different things? I don't care if somebody calls me a patient or a service user or a crazy person. I really don't care. It doesn't matter to me. But I understand and respect that you may use different words to describe your experience. And in my work, if my work is about my lived experience, my singular, unique lived experience, then it will never encompass all of your lived experiences. And I understand that. And when I see other people's work, I understand that we may have similar difficulties, but the ways in which they manifest are different. So just acknowledging that we all have these different experiences and we're all trying to work towards the same goal, as long as our intentions are the same, then we can acknowledge the difference and accept it. So there's quite a bit of infighting, I find. Like, again, can't we just be nice to each other? Life's too hard.
I definitely feel that can be the case, certainly in the neurodivergent community. I have 4 types of neurodivergence. And I was at a dinner party, actually, with a bunch of people, lots of artists, so lo and behold, lots of people with different lived experiences and brain states and things like that. And I found myself constantly interrupted and corrected with some of my language, and I was like, okay. I don't ever want to be defensive, but it did take me a moment to go, I've just got to stop and breathe and listen and think about why that challenges me, go away, research it, look into it. But also try and find the confidence in these moments of saying, well, this is the language that I've come up with and come to date, given that I didn't get to have a diagnosis until my early 20s. And sometimes I'm very guarded and coded with the language I use, depending on where I feel safe and who I'm talking to. There are some parts of my neurodivergence, not even my family, are really fully aware of. I talk about it publicly. This is the great irony, but my family never comes to anything. Legit. So that's why I figured, if one day they're actually sitting there, then they're going to get a whole history. But it is that sense of how do we find the modes of discussion that are embracive for everybody, allowing us to bring our vulnerabilities to the table and say, I'm still growing in this space and I can't represent everything. I
think the reality is that you will never find the one vernacular. And when you throw in, intersections of other identities, that I'm a brown, queer man with a disability, I'm going to offend somebody with the language I use. Sorry, I'm doing my best. In the same way that if somebody else, uses a different word to describe me, I try not to take offense, as long as the intention is that we're all here together to have this shared experience of understanding each other. And just accepting that instead of trying to find the one true, it's like all the acronyms to describe essentially brown people. Don't BAME me. I'm not interested.
So BAME
in
is black and minority ethnic, which is a common one in the UK.
Not anymore. We're trying to get rid of it.
Are you trying to get rid of it?
There's a good thing called BAME over now. So, but I'm not that offended. I might correct you and say, I don't use that word, but I'm not going to have a hissy fit about it, because I accept that it's impossible to use language that encompasses all of our complex identities. It's impossible, and I accept that.
We are, sadly, we're coming to the end of our dinner party, and I feel like I'm still hungry, and there's still lots to chat about. But as I say, I'm coming to a stage in my life where I'm just more and more dropping the masks that I've learnt to put on and be quite direct and confrontational. So I'm looking at you quite directly to ask the question, do you feel satisfied with our conversation. Is there anything that we haven't touched that you want to learn from these three amazing brains?
I don't have any more peas. They're all out.
We're all out of peas, but there's a lot of potatoes. I've probably got about half an hour of foyer time, and I would love to share it with you before I have no words. But I do have all of the thanks. Murakoze chane in the language of my mum's people. Thank you so much to Honor Eastly, to Daniel Regan, to Sally Hepworth. Thank you.